Hey there, everybody. As I announced earlier today on Facebook, at Friendly Chapel tonight, I gave my 12-step testimony of how God brought me out of a life of codependency and toxic relationships. And there were people who wanted to be there who couldn't. It was my goal to do a live broadcast, and I tried that, and about 10 seconds later it stopped. So this is not a quick process, but kind of stepping out in faith and seeing how God wants to use my story, which is terrifying. But sometimes you wonder what life would be like if you didn't do something, if you would regret it. So today I'm stepping out. I love you guys. Thank you for listening, and thank you for letting me share my story. I'll be reading it from a script as we do to kind of stay on topic, so I won't be looking at you the whole time or anything. So here goes. And feel free to share this with anyone you know that also needs to learn about codependency and learn a new way of life. So we are not alone. My name is Susej, and I'm a grateful believer in Jesus Christ. I'm in recovery for codependency and a list of hurts, habits, and hang-ups that I classify as self-destructive behaviors. I was married to an alcoholic and drug addict for 17 years. I am a widow and mother of 5 children. The most important moment of my life happened in early 2007 as I sat in an office in the back of a hospital emergency room. Having been told that my 31-year-old husband was probably dying and would certainly never work again, I made desperate calls to family and friends and cried out to God. As I sat there and wept quietly, an important question emerged from within. How did I get here? My thoughts raced. I knew how he got here. How did I get here? Why did I choose someone like this? Why did other women I knew not choose someone like this? I was unable to find the answer, but I knew that I had to return to the recovery program I'd been flirting with for 3 years, Celebrate Recovery, and not leave there until I figured out what had led me to where I was. Over the next several months, I attended meetings, started a step study, leaned on others, and lived in hospitals. I started the process of looking back over my life to identify what my issues were and what I could do about them. I grew up in a family that had lots of love, but lots of dysfunction. I worked hard to try to please everyone in my life, and I came to equate love with performance. My deep sense of unworthiness and abnormality permeated every relationship I had, and I was desperate to feel loved. After the divorce, I was lost in the shuffle of a stressful situation, and I felt a deep void in my life. I medicated with impurity, escapism, and food to cope, wore my fake smile, played the part of the clown, and made every attempt to be accepted by others. Eventually, my secret sins progressed to a more determined effort to rebel, drink and smoke marijuana, and become involved in immoral relationships. I felt happy when I was self-medicating and could be the life of the party. My family tried to redirect me, but I was determined to take things into my own hands and create the perfect life that I had always dreamed of. I wanted friends to feel love and joy, and I was waiting for a knight in shining armor to rescue me. As I became old enough to date boys, I wanted to marry everyone. This led me down a path of impurity, sin, rebellion, and an emotional roller coaster. When I was 18, I was set up on a blind date. I found out just before the date that I already knew him. He was a friend of a friend. He was handsome, independent, and strong, and it didn't take me long to want to marry him too. We were engaged within 6 months and married a year later against our parents' wishes. After all, I knew what was best, even if everyone didn't agree. Even though his mother had already warned me that he had an alcoholic personality, even though I had already seen him lash out in anger with no regard to the safety of others, even though my mother had dragged me along to 12-step meetings when I was a teenager and I thought I understood. After all, he had never drank, but as my drinking progressed, he joined in. Eventually, we made peace with our families, but my soul was restless. Things already weren't going well in my marriage, and I felt I'd ruined my life. In God's great love and mercy, he was calling me back. He delivered me from alcohol and marijuana, and I returned to the last place I had felt peace, my church family. The closer I grew to the Lord, the further my husband pushed away from me. Our marriage was painful and lonely for me, but in my magical codependent thinking, I just knew that I could do something that would change him. I tried my best to help everyone be perfect, and it did nothing but make our situation worse. My husband's drinking worsened, and he stayed gone as much as possible. I was a single parent for many years, and he lived a double life. We were the Christian family that his parents wanted him to have on the outside, and he had a secret life of various types of addiction that were leading him down a path to destruction. It's a good thing that God saved me, because it became my mission to pray for him and to protect our children. In 2003, after the birth of our third child, we visited Celebrate Recovery for the first time, but I still didn't understand that I wasn't going there to fix him, and I didn't commit because I didn't feel it was fair for me to always be the one to get help when he had all the problems. I would visit CR when I felt desperate and threatened to leave my husband, and he would pretend to change for a while, but continued making bad choices secretly. The choices that led me to the office in the back of the hospital emergency room that day. The next several months, I shuffled my kids to and from family and friends, lived in the hospital, and visited when he was moved out of state. This was a frantic time for me, a crash course in powerlessness, not knowing what the future would hold, but I'm so glad I made the choice to continue attending my meetings to get me help and to get through the most uncertain times of my life, to try to minister to my children in the midst of the storm. The first turning point in my recovery process was at a boundaries seminar with my sweet sponsor, Nancy. The simple truth that I had grown up without and continued to lack boundaries in my life and relationships was the truth that would begin setting me free. I began to have hope that day that I could do something about how out of control my life was. The messages that you get what you tolerate and that consequences grow people up gave me direction and helped me feel that nothing was wrong with me. I could take control of my life back and stop giving that control to others. The world seemed brighter that day. During the months of hospital living and near-death situations, I saw suffering like I had never seen in my life. Though I had been a Christian all my life, I met the real Jesus through that experience. God's gift of suffering allowed me to learn to completely depend on God and receive His unconditional love. These were foreign concepts for me because I had been trying to earn everyone's love, and I had spent my entire life trying to be strong, ashamed to ask anyone for help. If they only knew the real me. If they only knew what I had done and how shameful my life had become, they couldn't love me. How could God really love me when I wasn't perfect? I still continue to struggle in this area, but I've had so much healing. God continues to heal me, reveal more of Himself to me, and love me as a husband and a father. On one very special instance of God reassuring His love for me during those dark years, I was in church with my children, and one of my sons, 3 years old at the time, crawled up into my lap. It was his habit to put his face in my neck and cuddle with me. After he crawled up, and just before he put his face in my neck, he said, "Okay, Mom, you be God and I'll be Jesus." As he nuzzled into me, tears began to flow down my cheeks, and I realized that the love I had been looking for all my life, in all the wrong places and at any cost, was the love of God the Father. I had never thought of God in that way before. The Father with His Son on His lap in His embrace. His love washed over me that day, and He set me free from trying to be anything more than a child on my Father's lap, and to let God scoop me up and love me. The 3 weeks to live that my husband was given in 2007 turned into 6 years, and there were many ups and downs during this season. At one point, he finally was able to come home, devastated by sickness and deeply depressed, refusing to work a program of recovery. He relapsed and abandoned us the first time I laid down my healthy family boundaries. I had become a totally different and healthier person while he was gone, and he was used to threatening me, which usually resulted in my backing down, him having no consequences for his behavior, and continuing the cycle or game, as I like to call it. It was time for tough love, and no matter how hard it was, I would never again enable him to drink or mistreat me or my children. After a few months of running, he finally ended up completing a long-term rehab program and internship. For the first time, I saw significant change, and we decided to try being back together again. This was a joyful time, but that joy would not last as the old behaviors creeped in again and he relapsed. I told him he had to leave, and I knew that there would be no going back this time. He was again at death's door, and if I was anywhere in his picture, he would return to his addiction. I refused to sit there and watch him die. We went our separate ways, and I stayed the course. Throughout the several-year period of learning to break free and trying to save my marriage, I came to understand the addiction of codependency. I was addicted to this person and to all people for that matter. I was addicted to being needed and helping others to my own detriment. As I pulled away, I felt withdrawals, was overwhelmed with anxiety, cycled from anger to depression, and called someone every time I felt tempted to be drawn back in again. I held the boundaries, worked my program, and as boundary states, I learned to acquire grieving as a skill. There was much grieving in the letting go process, but much consolation in the desolation. I began to feel stronger and more alive and free than I had ever felt. I eventually began to help lead our Celebrate Recovery group for women who were codependent of the chemically addicted. I began to help other women as other women had helped me. I completed other step studies, and I got to see the power of redemption and recovery in my life and the lives of my children. Since the first time my husband abandoned us, which was devastating at the time, I had done quite a lot of next right things. I had sought support groups and lots of counseling for all of us. I had returned to the workforce to support my children, went back to school, worked hard to accept my life as it was and not as I would have it, in the words of the Serenity Prayer. One night, while I was in a women's victims of abuse support group, they were teaching about the abuse and honeymoon cycle and abusive relationships, and I realized in the midst of a group of women that had been abused far worse than I, that I was being abusive to my children. My face burned with shame, and my heart ached for them. It was time for all the yelling, anger, unreasonable punishments, and unreachable expectations to stop. I'm so thankful that God rescued me and gave me a new life for their sakes. I'm also glad that I was in a step study at the time and I had a place to take that and be supported. Over the last year of my husband's life, God gave us all peace and forgiveness. I took my children to visit as often as he was able to be awake to see them. Although I couldn't admit it, in hindsight, I can say that I knew that his time was short. As things looked worse, I felt an overwhelming urge to make amends with him, but the time never seemed right. I kept wondering if it was the right thing to do during such a terrible time for him, and he didn't always have his mental faculties due to his illness. I also wanted to make sure that my motives were right. It couldn't be because I wanted to relieve myself of guilt before he died. Because of the blessing of my recovery journey, I longed to make a true amends to him for my part of the family disease of alcoholism. No justification, no blame game, no fear. On the night before he died, I finally took the chance to talk to him. He was on a ventilator and unable to talk. As his chest heaved and he labored to breathe, I apologized for my part and asked him if he forgave me. He shook his head that he did. I asked him if he still loved me, and again he shook his head. I told him that I loved him too, and I always had. Forgiveness had set me free, and I no longer wanted justice for myself, but mercy and redemption for him. The next morning, his family invited me to come and be with him as he died. It was one of the most painful and beautiful days of my life. I had given him up so that God could save him. But on that last day, I got to be a wife to him, not because he deserved it, but because God loved both of us and was taking him home. The great redemption process was complete. It has been 3 years and 7 months since he passed, and the need for sobriety from codependency is as important as ever. Contrary to codependent belief, addicts aren't the cause of our problems. The absence of substance abuse addiction in my life didn't make everything magically better or perfect, but life is better because we have hope and truth. I'd like to share with you some of the most valuable lessons that I've learned on the journey. First, people may die, but addiction does not. Alcoholism and addiction are family diseases. And though the addict may be out of the picture, the behaviors, wrong thinking, and games are not. We must continue to seek healing and recovery to prevent repeating the same cycles in future relationships. Number 2, it really does begin with me. I was sick before my relationship, or I would have never been in it. He was sick before me and continued to be sick after me. If I wasn't the person in the toxic relationship with him, he would have had one with someone else. This knowledge helped me to stop taking things personally. It's an illness. If he could have stopped, he would have. And as al-anon states, I didn't cause it, I could not change it, and I could not control it. Number 3, in our Christian culture, we tend to equate codependency as being Christ-like. I had many well-meaning Christian women in my life telling me to let go of my expectations for my husband, which resulted in no standards and no reason for him to change. Many times I was told to submit to my husband, but I believe that submission to an addict is not the same thing and not what the gospel is calling us to do. Many do not understand the sick, dangerous, and sometimes violent thinking of an addict if they haven't experienced it firsthand. In the same way that you would not hand over the keys to your car over to someone who is drunk, God is not asking you to put you and your children at the mercy of a person who is under the control of drugs and alcohol. God will change someone, but sometimes the miracle we are waiting for is us making healthy choices, discontinuing or enabling, stepping aside at least temporarily to keep us and our children safe, and letting God work through those good choices. I learned that there is a God and it's not me. I learned that Jesus saves and I don't. In fact, I read through the 4 Gospels and examined every instance of how Jesus interacted with the people in his life. I am very happy to report to you that Jesus is not codependent. Here are some examples. Jesus did not enable or placate the people in his life when they made mistakes. He loved them and provided a standard by which to live. He did not enable them. He dealt with confrontation in a healthy way. He practiced excellent self-care, allowing himself time to rest and asking others to help him. He did not deem equality with God something to be grasped at, which I and my codependency have done many times. Does the term "realize I'm not God" sound familiar? He did not allow the abuse of himself or others. He removed himself from situations where others were lying in wait to attack him. He protected women, children, and many others from abuse. He shook the dust from his feet where he was not received and kept moving forward in forgiveness and love, not bitterness and shame. He followed the will of the Father and not his own will. He wasn't controlling. I realized one day that the reason they called this illness codependency is because no one would come to meetings for people who were controlling. My daily recovery journey looks very different than it did in the past. God has brought us from survival to stability. God has brought us from constant sorrow to frequent joy. God is rebuilding our lives and he is rewriting our story. The most important part of my journey now is acceptance and making every effort to help my children break the cycle. To anyone out there who is struggling not to codepend your children, be encouraged. If you are making the right choices, they will notice. If you have serenity, they will want it. And you can have peace even when they don't. Some of my most important tools for parenting children who have been affected by addiction are as follows. Self-care and working a program. Trusted accountability partners who will encourage you, not to enable, call you out when you are being codependent, and not jump on the negativity wagon. Next, the realization that addicts and codependents play a lot of games, and children who grow up watching those games will play them too. It's not personal, and it's not necessary to be drawn into those cycles of insanity. If we stop playing the games, help our children to identify when they are playing them, and educate ourselves on the diseases of addiction, of codependency, we can do our best to help them not go down the same path. It's really cold in here. Kind of shaking. Next, recognize when your children are medicating in any way. Do not live in denial, and initiate steps of intervention as early as possible. Last, we can never get relaxed or think that even if we have found sobriety from codependency, that it isn't possible for us to go back. It eventually became easy for me not to enable the addict. It was very hard to apply the same principles to my children. I was a guilty parent, and I was in danger of using them to meet my emotional needs, which is at the very heart of codependency. Our kids need consequences, tough love, and to be taught how to have healthy relationships. I have had to hospitalize children, administer medication when necessary, remove all luxuries and privileges from them to be earned back, and access to every resource I could find over the past several years. It is a heart-wrenching uphill battle much of the time, but I am no longer ruled by what others think of me, fueled by my emotions, and no longer paralyzed by rejection or lack of approval. Ultimately, I have accepted that I don't have any control over how my children live their lives in the future, and I have to trust God with the process. I'm getting better at not pressuring them to be perfect and being scared of what they might do or what might happen to them if I don't hover over and control them. However, having said that, if they make bad choices in the future, it won't be because I enabled them to do so or didn't provide an example of recovery for them to follow. To the newcomer, we are so proud of you for taking this first step to living a life of freedom. Though you may have come in sad and ashamed, or that may just be the way you're feeling right now, you will eventually realize that you were set apart for a reason. The devil wants to convince you that you should be ashamed of being where you are, but God has called you out of darkness and into the light. What you once hid, you will overcome and gladly share with others, so that they can have the opportunity to know the freedom that God has for us. God has always chosen the rejected, the failures, the imprisoned, the poor, and the lost to raise them up for such a time as this. Man's rejection was God's protection. Our brokenness is how people can see Jesus through us. We may have wanted an easier story, but there is a higher calling for which we cannot count the cost. We all want the resurrection, but that isn't possible without the crucifixion. It is by this process of surrendering to God's will and purification that we can be used to set the captives free and be part of the deliverance of our generations. And remember, Jesus could have risen from the dead with no scars, but he didn't. He did not hide them. He let them be touched. They were signs that he had overcome and signs that he was real. My greatest freedom is that I don't have to live in shame, hiding my scars anymore, or pretending to be anything that I'm not. I hope the same for you. Thank you for letting me share my story.